The dust devil twisted across the hard pan like a prayer made visible, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. Samuel McKenna watched it from the shade of his porch, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The ranch stretched before him, 1,500 acres of stubborn earth that had taught him more about perseverance than any preacher ever could. At 43, he had the kind of silence that came from living alone too long, the kind that settled into a man's bones and made him forget the sound of his own voice. The morning sun painted the distant mountains purple, but Samuel's eyes were fixed on the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney of the old homestead cabin 3 miles east. Someone had moved in 2 weeks ago, though he'd only caught glimpses of a woman and what looked like children. In a land where neighbors were scarce and privacy was respected like gospel, he'd kept his distance. But the smoke had been getting thinner each day, and that morning, there was none at all. Samuel's horse, a bay mare named Justice, nickered softly from the corral. She'd been his companion for 8 years, ever since he'd bought this land with money earned from driving cattle up the Chisholm Trail. Those days seemed like another lifetime now, full of dust and danger and the kind of brotherhood that only came from facing death together. But the trail had ended, the railroad had come, and men like Samuel had scattered like seeds on the wind, each looking for a piece of ground to call home. He drained his coffee and was about to head inside when he saw her. A small figure moving across the valley floor, stumbling more than walking, carrying what looked like a bundle in her arms. Even from a distance, he could tell something was wrong. The way she moved spoke of desperation, of someone who had reached the end of their rope and was still trying to climb. Samuel grabbed his hat and strode to the corral. Justice seemed to sense his urgency, standing still as he threw on her saddle. They rode hard across the valley, the morning air sharp in his lungs. As they drew closer, he could see that the figure was indeed a woman, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair that had escaped its pins and hung in tangles around her face. She wore a dress that had once been blue but was now the color of dust and desperation. In her arms, she carried a child, maybe 3 years old, whose face was flushed with fever. When she saw him approaching, she stopped and swayed on her feet. For a moment, Samuel thought she might run, but then she straightened her shoulders and waited. There was something in her posture that spoke of pride worn thin, but not yet broken. "Mum," Samuel said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "You look like you could use some help." She studied his face for a long moment, her eyes the color of storm clouds. "I don't want charity," she said, her voice hoarse. "I came to ask if you might have some bread to spare. I can work for it." Samuel looked at the child in her arms, noting the way the little one's breathing came quick and shallow. "Name's Samuel McKenna. This is my land you're on." "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to trespass. I'll go back." "Didn't say you were trespassing," Samuel replied gently. "Just telling you who I am. And you are, Margaret," she said after a pause. "Margaret Dalton. This is my son Thomas." Samuel nodded toward the child. "Boy looks sick." Margaret's composure cracked for just a moment, and Samuel saw the fear she'd been hiding. "He's been running a fever for 3 days. I've been trying to get him to the doctor in Clearwater, but—" She trailed off, and Samuel didn't need her to finish. Clearwater was 40 miles away and she was on foot. "My place is just over that ridge," Samuel said. "Got food, clean water, and a soft bed. Boy needs rest more than he needs a doctor right now." Margaret shook her head. "I can't. I don't have any way to pay you." "Didn't ask you to pay me," Samuel said. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the way pride and desperation warred in her face. "Look, ma'am, I don't know what brought you out here, and I don't need to know, but that boy needs help, and I've got help to give. Sometimes that's all there is to it." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she nodded slowly. Samuel helped her up onto Justice, then walked alongside as they made their way back to the ranch. The child stirred occasionally, mumbling words that Samuel couldn't quite make out, but his breathing seemed a little easier. The ranch house was modest but comfortable. Built from timber Samuel had cut himself from the mountains. He designed it with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze and windows that let in the morning light. It was a house meant for a family, though for 8 years it had known only one occupant. Samuel settled Margaret and Thomas in the main bedroom, bringing cool water and clean cloths. Margaret worked with quiet efficiency, bathing the child's forehead and whispering soft words of comfort. There was something about the way she moved, the gentle precision of her hands, that spoke of experience with sickness and healing. "I'll make some soup," Samuel said from the doorway. "And there's bread like you asked for." Margaret looked up at him, and for the first time, her expression softened. "Thank you," she said simply. Samuel nodded and retreated to the kitchen. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could manage soup and biscuits. As he worked, he found himself listening to the soft murmur of Margaret's voice from the bedroom, the way she talked to her son, even though the child was mostly asleep. It was a sound he hadn't heard in his house since ever. When he brought the food to the bedroom, Margaret was sitting in the chair beside the bed, her head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed. She looked exhausted, as if she'd been carrying a weight too heavy for her shoulders for too long. Samuel set the tray on the dresser and quietly left the room. That evening, as the sun painted the sky red and gold, Margaret emerged from the bedroom. Thomas was sleeping peacefully, his fever finally broken. She found Samuel on the porch, whittling a piece of wood in the dying light. "He's better," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "The fever broke about an hour ago." "Good?" Samuel said, not looking up from his work. "Soup help." "Everything helped," Margaret said. "I don't know how to thank you." Samuel continued whittling, the soft scrape of the knife against wood the only sound between them. "Finally," he said, "don't need thanks. Just glad the boy's better." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "We had a farm," she said quietly. "My husband James and I, about 60 miles northeast of here. We'd been there 5 years, building it up, making it work." She paused, her hands folded in her lap. "James died last winter. Pneumonia. I tried to keep the farm going, but," she shrugged, "I wasn't strong enough, I guess. The bank took it last month." Samuel nodded but didn't speak. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best thing you could offer someone was silence, a space for their words to settle. "I heard there was work in Clearwater," Margaret continued. "Figured I could find something, maybe cleaning or cooking. We started walking 3 days ago, but Thomas got sick and She trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. "You did what you had to do," Samuel said quietly. "That's what people do, they keep going." "I used to think that," Margaret said. "But lately, I wonder if sometimes keeping going is just another kind of giving up." Samuel looked at her then, seeing the weight of loss in her eyes. "Maybe," he said. "But I reckon as long as you're still drawing breath, you've got a chance to write a different ending." Margaret smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. "You're not what I expected, Mr. McKenna." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Most men living out here alone, they get strange, suspicious. You're different." Samuel went back to his whittling. "Maybe I am strange. Maybe I'm just strange in a different way." The next morning, Thomas was sitting up in bed. His color returned and his appetite back. Margaret made breakfast, moving around Samuel's kitchen with an ease that surprised them both. She'd found his meager supplies and somehow turned them into something that tasted like home. "I should go," she said as they finished eating. "You've been more than kind. But I need to get to Clearwater." Samuel nodded, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of watching them walk away. "I'll hitch up the wagon. Drive you there." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to, but it's 40 miles and the boy's just getting over being sick. Besides, I need supplies from town anyway." It was a lie, but a small one. Samuel had plenty of supplies, but he found himself reluctant to let Margaret and Thomas face the road alone. They made the journey in Samuel's wagon, Thomas sitting between them, chattering about everything he saw. The child had an easy way about him, the kind of openness that came from being loved and protected. Margaret had done that, Samuel realized. Despite everything she'd lost, she'd kept her son's world safe and full of wonder. Clearwater was a growing town, with a main street lined with shops and businesses. Samuel helped Margaret down from the wagon and watched as she straightened her dress and smoothed her hair. She was trying to look respectable, professional, ready to work. "I'll ask around," Samuel said. "See if anyone's hiring." "I can do that myself," Margaret replied, but not unkindly. "I know you can. But I know these people. Might save you some time." Margaret considered this, then nodded. "Thank you." Samuel spent the morning making inquiries while Margaret and Thomas waited in the wagon. The news wasn't good. The hotel was fully staffed, the restaurant wasn't hiring, and the general store owner had looked at Samuel like he was crazy for asking. "Woman with a child," the store owner had said. "Who's gonna hire someone like that? She'll be more trouble than she's worth." Samuel had to clench his fist to keep from saying something he'd regret. Instead, he touched his hat and walked away. He found Margaret and Thomas at the wagon, sharing a piece of penny candy that Thomas must have talked her into buying. When she saw Samuel's expression, her face fell. "No luck?" she asked. "Not much," Samuel admitted, "but there's always tomorrow. You can stay at the hotel tonight, get a fresh start in the morning." Margaret shook her head. "I can't afford the hotel. We'll camp outside town." "The hell you will," Samuel said, then immediately apologized for his language. "Sorry, but you're not camping out with a sick child. I'll pay for the hotel." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I won't take charity." They stared at each other for a long moment, and Samuel could see the stubborn pride in her eyes. It was the same pride that had kept her walking when she was dead on her feet, the same pride that had made her ask for bread instead of begging for help. "All right," Samuel said finally. "But you're coming back to the ranch with me, just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure something else out." Margaret wanted to argue, he could see it in her face. But Thomas was tugging on her sleeve, asking if they were going back to the nice man's house with the good soup, and she couldn't say no. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Samuel found himself stealing glances at Margaret, noticing the way she held herself straight despite her exhaustion, the way she kept one hand on Thomas's back as if to reassure herself he was still there. That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep, Samuel and Margaret sat on the porch again. The night was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. "What are you going to do?" Samuel asked. Margaret was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," she said finally. "I used to have plans. James and we had it all figured out. We were going to build up the farm, maybe have more children. Grow old together," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Funny how life doesn't care about your plans." "No," Samuel agreed, "it doesn't." "What about you?" Margaret asked. "What brought you out here?" Samuel considered the question. He'd told the story so many times in his head that he'd almost forgotten how to tell it out loud. "I was married once," he said finally. "Her name was Sarah. We had a place back in Missouri, smaller than this but good land. She was everything I wasn't. Bright, funny, could make friends with anybody. She wanted to come west, said we could build something bigger, something that would last." Samuel paused, remembering. "We made it as far as Kansas before she took sick. Cholera, she died in a wagon train camp, and I buried her under a cottonwood tree beside a creek whose name I never learned." Margaret was quiet, waiting. "I kept going because I didn't know what else to do," Samuel continued. "Found this place, bought it, built the house. Told myself I was building it for her, that somehow she'd know I'd kept the promise we made to each other. But really, I think I was just trying to build something that couldn't be taken away." "And did you?" Margaret asked softly. "Build something that couldn't be taken away." Samuel looked out at his land, at the house he'd built with his own hands, at the life he'd carved out of the wilderness. "I don't know," he said. "I thought I had, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe the things that can't be taken away aren't the things you build. Maybe they're the things you give." They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Margaret spoke. "James used to say that home wasn't a place. It was a feeling. I never understood what he meant until after he died. Then I realized that home had died with him, and I've been looking for it ever since." "Maybe you don't find it," Samuel said. "Maybe you make it." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "But I don't know how to make it alone." Samuel looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman who'd stumbled into his life asking for bread, but someone who understood loss the way he did. Someone who'd learned that sometimes the hardest thing in the world was getting up each morning and choosing to keep going. "Maybe you don't have to," he said quietly. Margaret turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, he could see the hope and fear warring in her eyes. "Samuel, I know it's crazy," he said quickly. "We barely know each other, but I look at you and Thomas, and I think maybe Sarah would understand. I think maybe she'd want me to stop building monuments to the past and start building something for the future." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if I can do that again," she said finally. "Open my heart to someone, trust that they won't leave. I can't promise I won't die," Samuel said. "Nobody can promise that. But I can promise I won't leave by choice. I can promise that if you'll have me, I'll spend every day I've got left trying to build something good with you. And Thomas, he's part of you. If I want you, I want him too. Hell, I already do. Kids got more sense than most grown men I've met. Margaret laughed, and it was the first time Samuel had heard her laugh without sadness in it. He does, doesn't he? So Samuel asked. What do you say? Margaret looked out at the land, at the house that had been built for love but had known only solitude. I say Thomas is going to be very excited about having a horse to ride. Samuel grinned. Justice would like that. She's been lonely too. We'll all have, Margaret said softly. Samuel reached for her hand and she didn't pull away. Her fingers were small and work-worn, but they fit perfectly in his. So we'll figure it out together, he said. All of us. Together. Margaret agreed. They sat on the porch until the stars wheeled overhead, planning a future that neither had dared to imagine just days before. Thomas would need schooling and Samuel could teach him about the land, about horses and cattle, and the kind of hard work that built character. Margaret could plant a garden, maybe keep chickens. They'd need to expand the house, add a proper parlor and maybe another bedroom for when Thomas got older. As the night wore on, they talked about practical things and impossible dreams, about the past they'd both lost and the future they might build together. And for the first time in 8 years, Samuel's house felt like a home. The next morning, Thomas woke to find Samuel teaching him how to curry justice, showing him how to move the brush in long, gentle strokes. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as she made breakfast, marveling at the sight of her son laughing as the big horse nuzzled his hair. He's good with children, she said to herself, then realized she was already thinking of Samuel as part of their lives, as if the decision had been made without her even knowing it. After breakfast, Samuel hitched up the wagon again. We need to go back to town, he said, but not for work. We need to see the preacher. Margaret raised an eyebrow. The preacher. Well, if we're going to do this, we might as well do it right. Besides, I want the whole territory to know that Samuel McKenna finally found himself a family worth keeping. Margaret blushed, but she was smiling. What if he says no? What if he thinks we're moving too fast? Then we'll find another preacher, Samuel said simply. Or I'll perform the ceremony myself. I've got a Bible. You can't marry yourself, Margaret laughed. Can I? It's my land, my house, my woman, and my boy. Seems like I should be able to marry whoever I want. Your woman and your boy, Margaret asked, but she wasn't offended. There was something about the way Samuel said it, with such fierce protectiveness that made her heart flutter. If you'll have me, Samuel said, suddenly serious. Both of you. I know I'm not much. I'm too quiet, too set in my ways. I've got more conversations with my horse than I do with most people. But I promise you this, I'll love you both with everything I've got, and I'll never stop trying to be the man you deserve. Margaret stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek. You're already the man I deserve? She said softly. You just don't know it yet. The wedding was small, held in the Clearwater church with the preacher's wife and the general store owner as witnesses. Thomas stood beside Samuel. Holding the rings they'd bought that morning, his chest puffed out with the importance of his job. Margaret wore a simple dress she'd found at the dry goods store, but Samuel thought she looked more beautiful than any woman he'd ever seen. When the preacher asked if there was anyone who objected to the union, Thomas piped up with, I object to waiting any longer. Can we get to the kissing part? The small congregation laughed, and Samuel felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. This was what family felt like, he realized. Not just love, but laughter. Not just commitment, but joy. They drove back to the ranch as the sun was setting, Thomas asleep between them in the wagon. Margaret's hand rested on Samuel's arm, and he could feel the weight of her wedding ring against his skin. No regrets, he asked quietly. None, Margaret said firmly. You. Samuel looked at his wife, at the boy who was now his son, at the land that would be their home. Known, he said. That night, after Thomas had been tucked into his new bed in his new room, Samuel and Margaret sat on the porch again. But this time Margaret was curled against Samuel's side, her head on his shoulder. I used to think that asking for help was a sign of weakness, Margaret said. That day I came here I was so ashamed. I felt like a failure. You weren't asking for help, Samuel said. You were asking for bread. There's a difference? Is there? Bread is something you earn, help is something you accept. You came here ready to work for what you needed. That's not weakness, that's strength. Margaret tilted her head to look at him. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just a man who's learned that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst. 8 years ago, I thought losing Sarah was the end of my story. Turns out it was just the end of the first chapter. And now, Samuel kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. Now I'm looking forward to chapter 2. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Justice nickered softly in response. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched over the land for countless generations, the same stars that would watch over the family that Samuel and Margaret were just beginning to build. "Do you think James would approve?" Margaret asked suddenly. Samuel considered the question seriously. "I think any man who loved you would want you to be happy. And I think any man who loved Thomas would want him to have a father who'd protect him and teach him how to be a good man." "And what about Sarah?" "I think Sarah would have liked you very much. I think she would have been happy to know that her death wasn't the end of love in this house, just the beginning of a different kind of love." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I love you, Samuel McKenna." "I love you too, Margaret McKenna." They made love that night in the room that had been Samuel's alone for 8 years, and it was different from anything either had known before. It wasn't the desperate passion of youth, or the comfortable familiarity of long marriage. It was something deeper, something that came from two people who had lost everything and found each other in the ruins. The next morning, Thomas woke early and ran to the kitchen, where he found Samuel making coffee and Margaret fixing breakfast. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of his mother and his new father working together, the easy way they moved around each other, the soft murmur of their conversation. "Are we really staying?" he asked. Samuel knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. "We're really staying, son. This is our home now." Thomas nodded solemnly, then broke into a grin. "Can I ride Justice today, after breakfast?" Samuel promised. "But first, we need to talk about chores. Every man on this ranch has to pull his weight." "I'm not a man," Thomas said. "I'm 7. 7's plenty old enough to start learning how to be a man," Samuel said. "Your mother and I are going to teach you everything we know." Thomas looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "It's true," she said. "We're all going to learn together." As they ate breakfast, Samuel found himself marveling at how quickly his life had changed. A week ago, he'd been a man alone, comfortable in his solitude, convinced that he'd found all the peace he was going to get in this life. Now his house rang with laughter, his table was full, and his heart was fuller still. After breakfast, true to his word, Samuel lifted Thomas onto Justice's back and led the horse around the corral. Margaret watched from the fence, her hands clasped together, her face bright with joy. This was what she'd wanted for her son, Samuel realized. Not just safety and shelter, but the kind of childhood that built confidence and character. "You're a natural, Thomas," Samuel called out as the boy grew more comfortable in the saddle. "Your father must have been a horseman. Papa had a horse named Thunder." Thomas called back. "He was black with white spots. That's a good name for a horse," Samuel said. "What do you think we should name the colt that's coming in the spring?" Thomas's eyes went wide. "Justice is going to have a baby." "She is, and that colt is going to need a name." Thomas thought for a moment, his face serious with concentration. "Hope," he said finally. "We should name her Hope." Samuel looked at Margaret, who was smiling through tears. "Hope it is," he said. That evening, as the family sat on the porch again, Margaret asked Samuel about his plans for the ranch. "I've been thinking about that," Samuel said. "I've got good grazing land, but I could use more cattle. And I've been thinking about maybe building a barn, something bigger than what I've got now." "That sounds expensive," Margaret said. "It is, but I've got some money saved, and cattle prices are good right now. Besides, I've got help now. Thomas here can learn to be a cowboy and you can do whatever you want to do." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to have a garden," she said finally. "A big one. Maybe sell veg an idea," Samuel said. "And maybe we could get some chickens like you mentioned." "And a pig," Thomas added. "I want a pig." "A pig," Margaret laughed. "What do you want with a pig? They're smart," Thomas said seriously. "And they're good for eating bugs in the garden?" Samuel grinned. The boys got a point, and pork's always good eating. As the weeks passed, the McKenna family settled into a routine. Samuel taught Thomas to ride and rope, to read the weather and the land, to treat animals with respect and kindness. Margaret planted her garden and tended it with the same care she'd once given to her farm in Kansas. The vegetables grew strong and healthy, and by late summer she was selling produce in Clearwater twice a week. Samuel expanded the herd, buying 20 head of cattle from a rancher who was moving to California. The animals grazed contentedly on the rich grass of the valley, growing fat and healthy. Thomas named every one of them, much to Samuel's amusement and Margaret's exasperation. "You can't name cattle," Margaret said one evening as Thomas recounted the adventures of Buttercup and Daisy. "Why not?" Thomas asked. "They're part of the family." "Cattle aren't family," Margaret said gently. "They're livestock, but they live with us?" Thomas protested. "That makes them family." Samuel caught Margaret's eye and winked. "The boy's got a point," he said. "And named cattle are easier to keep track of." Margaret threw her hands up in mock defeat. "Fine. But when it comes time to sell them, you're going to have to explain to Thomas why Buttercup is going to market." "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Samuel said. As autumn approached, Margaret's garden produced more vegetables than the family could eat or sell. She began preserving them, filling the pantry with jars of beans and corn and tomatoes. Samuel watched her work with admiration, marveling at her efficiency and skill. "You're going to keep us fed all winter," he said one evening as she sealed the last jar of pickles. "That's the idea," Margaret said. "I never want to be hungry again, and I never want Thomas to be hungry again." Samuel understood. He'd grown up poor himself, had known the gnawing ache of an empty belly. It was a memory that never quite left you, the fear that the next meal might not come. "You don't have to worry about that anymore," he said quietly. "I'll always provide for you and Thomas." Margaret looked at him, seeing the seriousness in his eyes. "I know," she said, "but I need to know that I can provide too. Not just for Thomas, but for all of us. It's important to me." Samuel nodded, understanding. Margaret had lost everything once, had been forced to depend on the kindness of strangers. She needed to know that she could stand on her own if she had to, even if she never had to again. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that covered the valley in a blanket of white. Samuel and Thomas spent their days tending the cattle, breaking ice on the water troughs, and hauling hay to the animals. Margaret worked inside, cooking and mending and teaching Thomas his letters. On the coldest nights, they would sit by the fire, Samuel whittling while Margaret sewed and Thomas played with wooden toys that Samuel had made for him. They would tell stories, sing songs, and plan for the spring. It was the kind of winter that built families, the kind that created memories that would last a lifetime. One night in February, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled against the windows, Margaret asked Samuel about his dreams. "I used to dream about having enough," he said. "Enough food, enough money, enough land. But now I dream about having too much laughter, too much love, too many years to spend with you and Thomas." Margaret smiled. "Those are good dreams. What about you? What do you dream about?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas play with his toys by the fire. "I dream about Thomas growing up here, learning to be a man from you. I dream about more children, maybe a daughter who looks like you. I dream about growing old on this porch, watching our grandchildren play in the yard." "All of that sounds possible," Samuel said. "Does it? Margaret, a year ago I was alone. I thought I'd always be alone. If you'd told me then that I'd have a wife and son by now, I'd have laughed at you. If dreams like that can come true, then any dream can come true." In the spring, just as Samuel had predicted, the colt was a filly, chestnut with white markings, and Thomas named her Hope, as he'd promised. The little horse was frisky and playful, and Thomas spent hours in the corral with her, teaching her to trust and follow. Margaret's garden was bigger that year, and more productive. She'd learned what grew best in the valley's soil, and she'd developed a reputation in Clearwater for the quality of her vegetables. The general store owner had started placing regular orders, and Margaret found herself making more money than she'd ever imagined. "At this rate, we'll be able to expand the herd again next year," Samuel said one evening as they counted the money from Margaret's sales. "And maybe add on to the house," Margaret said. "Thomas is getting bigger and—" She trailed off, blushing. Samuel looked at her sharply. "Margaret, I'm expecting," she said quietly. "The baby should come in the fall." Samuel whooped with joy, scooping Margaret up in his arms and spinning her around. Thomas looked up from his toys, grinning at his parents' happiness. "Is there going to be a baby?" he asked. "There is," Margaret said, her face glowing with happiness. "You're going to be a big brother." Thomas thought about this for a moment. "Can I teach the baby to ride Hope?" "When the baby's old enough," Samuel promised, "but you'll have to be very careful. Babies are fragile." "I'll be careful," Thomas said solemnly. "I'll be the best big brother ever." The baby was born in October, during the first snowfall of the season. It was a difficult birth, and for a while, Samuel feared he might lose both Margaret and the child. But Dr. Williams from Clearwater arrived in time, and by morning Samuel was holding his daughter in his arms. "She's beautiful," he whispered, studying the tiny face that was so like Margaret's. "What should we name her?" Margaret asked, exhausted but radiant. Samuel thought for a moment. "Sarah," he said finally. "After my first wife. She'd want us to remember her, but she'd also want us to live. I think she'd be honored to have this little one carry her name." Margaret smiled. "Sarah McKenna. I like it." Thomas was fascinated by his new sister, insisting on helping with everything from feeding to diaper changes. He talked to her constantly, telling her about the ranch, about the animals, about all the things he was going to teach her when she got bigger. "She's going to be a cowgirl," he announced one day as he watched Margaret nurse the baby. "How do you know?" Margaret asked. "Because she's a McKenna," Thomas said simply. "And McKennas are tough." Samuel laughed. He's got that right. As winter settled over the valley again, the McKenna family hunkered down in their warm house, content in their togetherness. Samuel had built a cradle for Sarah, and she slept peacefully by the fire while her parents and brother went about their evening routines. One night, as Samuel was banking the fire and Margaret was settling the baby, Thomas came to him with a serious expression. "Papa Samuel," he said, using the name he'd chosen for his stepfather, "are you going to leave us?" Samuel knelt down, meeting the boy's eyes. "No, son. I'm not going anywhere." "Why would you ask that?" "Because my first papa left," Thomas said quietly. "He didn't want to, but he left anyway, and I thought maybe you might leave too." Samuel felt his heart break a little. "Thomas, your first papa didn't leave by choice. He got sick, and sometimes people die when they get sick. It's not because they want to leave, it's just something that happens." "But what if you get sick?" "Then I'll fight as hard as I can to get better," Samuel said. "And if I can't get better, I'll know that your mama,